Bread was not invented by farmers. It was invented by people who did not farm at all, who had no fields, no crops, and no idea that agriculture would exist for another 10,000 years. Everything you were taught about the order these inventions happened in is backwards, and the evidence for that is baked into a piece of charred food scientists found in a desert in Jordan. That is the story of bread. Not a story about ovens or wheat fields or a farmer with a stroke of genius. It is a story about hungry people grinding whatever they could find into paste, roots, wild seeds, anything with enough starch to be worth the effort, spreading that paste onto something hot because it was the only way to keep it from spoiling, and accidentally discovering that heat turns paste into something else entirely. Something that lasts. Something you can carry. Something that 14,000 years later still comes off a hot surface looking almost exactly the same. In 2018, a team led by archaeobotanist Amaya Arans Otaigui at the University of Copenhagen was excavating a site called Shubayqa I in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan. They were looking at hearths left behind by Natufian hunter-gatherers, people who lived roughly 14,400 years ago, thousands of years before anyone in the region planted a single seed on purpose. Inside one of those fire pits, they found tiny charred fragments, crumbs, barely a centimeter across. They sent them to a lab for microscopic analysis, expecting burnt seeds or scorched nuts, the usual leftovers of a hearth this old. What came back instead was flatbread. Made from wild einkorn wheat and the ground-up tubers of a marsh plant called club rush, mixed into a dough and cooked directly on hot stones or ash. Bread, 4,000 years before farming existed anywhere on Earth. For most of the last century, the timeline everyone assumed was simple. Farming first, grain surplus second, bread last, the reward for finally domesticating wheat. That order made intuitive sense, so almost nobody tested it very hard. Shubayqa I broke it completely. These were not farmers with a granary and a harvest to manage. They were mobile foragers, grinding whatever wild plants they could gather that week, and they had already figured out how to turn that grind into bread. Some researchers now argue the relationship actually runs the other way, that the labor of gathering and grinding enough wild grain to keep making bread is exactly the kind of pressure that would push a hungry group toward planting seeds on purpose instead of wandering to find them. The surplus did not come first. The bread did. Farming may have followed the craving, not the other way around. There is a related argument that gets dragged into this debate constantly, about which came first, bread or beer, because both start with the exact same ground grain, and both have been used to explain why humans supposedly gave up wandering for good. In 1953, archaeologist Robert Braidwood proposed it was beer, not bread, that pulled early humans toward planting grain on purpose. It is a fun theory. It does not hold up against the dates. The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate fermentation, stone mortars from Rakafet Cave in Israel carrying residue of malted, fermented cereal, dates to roughly 13,000 years ago. That is a good 10,000 years after flour was already showing up on the grinding stone at Ohalo II. Whatever eventually pulled humans toward farming on purpose, bread had a head start measured in millennia, not centuries. And it goes back even further than that. At a site called Ohalo II, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel, a brush hut floor from a small camp was sealed underwater for thousands of years after the lake rose, which kept the site airless and remarkably preserved. Inside it, archaeologists recovered a grinding stone dated to roughly 23,000 years old. In 2015, a team led by Einit Sneer at Bar Ilan University examined it under a microscope and found starch granules embedded in the surface. Residue from wild barley that had been deliberately ground into flour. No bread survived from that particular site. Charred crumbs need a fire that catches them at exactly the wrong moment, and most of the time that never happens. But the flour did survive, trapped in the stone that made it, and it tells you that people were processing wild grain into something bread-like 9,000 years before Shubayqa, and 18,000 years before the first domesticated wheat field anywhere on the planet. And this was not a single lucky accident that happened once, in one place, in the Middle East. In 2010, a researcher named Anna Revedin and her team examined grinding stones from 3 separate sites scattered across Europe. Bilancino in Italy, Kostanki in Russia, and Pavlov in the Czech Republic. All three, unconnected, roughly 30,000 years old. All three carried the same starch residue, this time from the roots of cattail plants, ground into flour, and almost certainly cooked into flat cakes on hot stone. A later study at Grotta Paglici in southern Italy, dated to roughly 32,000 years ago, found the same pattern again, this time using ground wild oats. Different continents, different plants, different centuries, separated by thousands of kilometers and no contact with each other. And each group had independently figured out the exact same trick. Grind a starchy plant into paste, cook it flat on a hot surface, and it stops being paste and starts being food that keeps. None of them were trying to invent a food category. They were trying to solve a much smaller, much more urgent problem. Raw ground plant material is hard to digest, hard to store, and it spoils within a day or two. Heat solved all three problems at once, and none of these people needed to know why. The heat broke the starch down into something the body could actually absorb, so it stopped being a stomachache and started being calories. The heat killed the bacteria that would otherwise rot the wet paste almost immediately. And the heat turned something formless and perishable into something dry, dense, and portable. Something you could wrap up and carry on the next hunt without it falling apart in your hand. Bread was not the goal. Bread was the byproduct of people refusing to waste the only food they had gathered that day. Nobody involved understood starch, or bacteria, or the chemistry of a crust forming under heat. They understood one thing only. Paste that sat in the sun for a day went bad, and paste that got pressed flat and left on a hot stone did not. Right now, in a bakery somewhere, someone is pulling a tray of flatbread off a hot stone using a method that has not fundamentally changed in 23,000 years, long before that bakery had a name, a country, or a language to write its recipes down in. The wheat is domesticated now. The stone is an oven. Nobody grinding that flour today is thinking about a forager on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, or a hearth in the black desert of Jordan, or a cave in southern Italy. But the sequence is identical. Grind it, wet it, flatten it, cook it on something hot. That is the whole invention, discovered independently by people with no writing, no metal, and no idea that farming would ever exist. Longer ago than agriculture, longer ago than pottery, longer ago than the dog. Bread was never invented. Not in the way we usually mean that word. It was discovered, by accident, by hungry people just trying to survive the week without wasting what little food they had. And they found it a very long time before anyone had the slightest idea what a farm was.